correct me if I'm wrong, but if the United States were to be powered by wind turbines, it would require landmass the size of two whole Californias. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that estimate is from 2010, which I think is well before we were realizing that we actually have growing energy demands right now,
Yeah.
given artificial intelligence and data centers. So I would wager that that's probably actually higher now, if we were to try to power the US on wind turbines alone.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in the state of Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined as always by my co-host Amy Cooke. And for this week's show, we're actually going to bring back a returning guest to discuss her brand new policy report. I often say this about a lot of guests, but I sincerely mean this about this one. I love this report. Everything about this just speaks right to my heart because it's issues that I've cared about since I've gotten into this space. Before we introduce the guests, I'll kick it to you to tee up what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, and we'll just tease as to who it is. But we had her on before with another great report. But this, not only is it stuff that is near and dear to our heart, Jake, but it's also relevant to Colorado.
Absolutely.
And what we're going to talk about today is a report. It's titled Shattered Green Dreams, the Environmental Costs of Wind and Solar. And this is the the very real but always ignored environmental cost that wind and solar are responsible for. You talk about that; they love to talk about wind and solar only in emissions only. It's that myopic, it's that Colorado perspective, single lens. It's a myopic view. We're only going to judge wind and solar by their emissions at the generating source. It's not even like total emissions over life cycle or all the things that you need to bring to bear just to get wind and solar, just to deploy it. It is from one small point in time that wind and solar are judged, and it is by their emissions only. And to talk about the total cost, and not even in dollars and cents, but in environmental impact, is Sarah Montalbano. She does energy and environmental policy at the Center of the American Experiment in Minnesota. She's also an Alaska native, so she knows of what she speaks when it comes to energy. Two states that have been, for whom actually energy is a huge issue in both states. But Sarah, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for this study. It is incredibly impactful, meaningful for those of us here in Colorado. But I want to give it over to you and let you talk about you can probably put these trade-offs into buckets. There is the materials, there's land use, and there's sort of wildlife and ecological concerns. And we also, I guess, have to throw in there recycling and a whole bunch of other things, decommissioning, which we've talked about on this show as well. But Sarah, let's get to your study, Shattered Green Dreams. What was the impetus? What was the spark? What made you do it? And then let's talk about some key takeaways for everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Amy, Jake. I appreciate y'all having me again. This report has been a long time in the making, and we were coming up with this idea a couple of years ago when we were seeing that these costs are not being well talked about. And I think the whole idea of this paper is that there are trade-offs. There are challenges and benefits to every kind of electricity generation, and that solar and wind and battery storage actually do have negative costs on the environment, and in a lot of tangible ways that we all really care about. Being an Alaskan, I really do appreciate the outdoors. I appreciate the beauty of it. But I also appreciate that we need natural resource development too, and that in many ways, wind and solar cannot actually power, Alaska's future. So that's why I'm in energy policy in the general sense. And when we look at this report, I think there's a lot of important things, especially for the material takeaways, because all of these technologies require construction materials, and a lot of those materials are coming from overseas, where we're not controlling the environmental effects of that mining and manufacturing, and we're not also controlling the worker health and safety standards either. And then, of course, I think the ecological effects are near and dear to my heart. I think we are seeing mounting evidence that these things aren't costless for wildlife either. And then, of course, life cycle concerns, because wind and solar need to be replaced more often. They are compounding their environmental effects, especially in materials where you have to replace them. And then land use, too. They're so intermittent and diffuse that you need at least 10 times the land area to generate the same amount of electricity as you would a coal or natural gas fired plant. So that compounds the environmental costs as well.
Yeah, I kind of want to jump off on that point. And like I said at the top of the show, this is so near and dear to my heart. Just quick aside, the Independence Institute website, for all of our employees, they ask us to provide two of our favorite quotes on our little employee profile. And one of mine is the famous Thomas Sowell quote, "There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs." And that's why I love this report so much, because it gets into those trade-offs that are, as you mentioned, just very often not discussed. One of those being land use. We hear so much, you mentioned being an Alaskan, you love the outdoors, you love the beautiful vistas up there. That's, very similar. I think a lot of Coloradans feel the same way about the Rocky Mountain West in general. It's beautiful. We love our outdoor spaces, the ability to go enjoy that, and whether it's hiking, camping, sport shooting, you name it. Dive into a little bit of those land use figures. You mentioned 10 times the land, but is it mostly wind? Is it mostly solar? Is it both? Is it batteries? What are we really talking about here in terms of what is driving the demand for land for these resources?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I also went to college at Montana State University, so I have a lot of appreciation for the Mountain West, too. When we talk about these things, it's at least 10 times for wind and solar, but that really depends on the characteristics of the project. One figure I cite in the report says that utility scale photovoltaic panels require at least 3.5 to 10 acres per megawatt. And concentrated solar is up to 16.5 acres per megawatt. And all of that is really quite a lot. Wind turbines need a lot of spacing distance so that they don't interfere with the wind flow over the other turbines in their area. And I think this really hammers home when we look at the most energy dense source of electricity, which is nuclear power. I'm a huge fan of nuclear. And a 1 gigawatt nameplate capacity nuclear plant only needs 1.3 square miles of land area for, the reactors itself. And a comparable solar installation to generate the same amount of electricity would need between 45 and 75 square miles. So let that sink in, and then we can talk wind. Because wind installations, given the wider spacing needs, need between 260 and 3,360 square miles.
Wow.
That's incredible. Yeah, that floored me when I was going through the research on this one.
And I think you include in your paper an anecdote from, I believe it was Václav Smil, talking about putting it into perspective. I think it was just wind turbines he was talking about. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but if the United States were to be powered by wind turbines, it would require landmass the size of 2 whole Californias. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that estimate is from 2010, which I think is well before we were realizing that we actually have growing energy demands right now, given artificial intelligence and data centers. So I would wager that that's probably actually higher now if we were to try to power the U.S. on wind turbines alone.
And wind turbines have gotten larger.
That's true.
So you would need even more space. One of the things that has interested me, and I've written about this as far back as probably 2010, 2011, is the materials. But there's the concrete and steel, and we can get to that. But it's also the rare earth elements. It's the mining, it's the processing. And they don't do that in places. They don't get those materials in places that have, or like the United States, where we actually have environmental standards. I liken this to maybe what it was like when Colorado first mined uranium and would just dump it. Or, you just, oh, okay, it's radioactive. We'll just throw it in this river. They're mining and processing in places in China. And it's heavily polluted. There's the Congo, which Chinese owned. They're using sometimes very small children. In China, they use the Uyghurs. These are more than just trade-offs, right? Like, these are environmental and sometimes humanitarian crimes.
Absolutely. I truly believe that the US is making a value judgment each and every time we outsource a mining project to a foreign country where we cannot actually account for the environmental and worker health and safety costs. I'm glad you brought up the Department of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because a Department of Labor report in 2024 actually, I cite that they found 52% of their cobalt workers actually reported that there were children working at their mine site. That's a majority of these mines, and the workers interviewed said that. The other thing that I think is really concerning is that this is just not a reasonable plan for environmental stewardship. And I examine a couple case studies in the report just from the last 2 years, actually. I didn't have to go back farther than that because there was plenty to talk about. But in Indonesia, in March of this year, a tailings dam collapsed. It flooded the nearby village. A second breach killed one worker and two more were missing at the time of that report. And what I find really interesting about this is that they originally didn't plan to do any tailings at all. They were originally planning to just dump it into the ocean, which I can't imagine is a responsible thing to do for the environment. So there's so much to talk about here. It's not only a national security issue, but it's a values thing, I think, for the U.S.
And I just want to say one thing too. I was actually at a conference, a legislative conference, and it was for women. It was female. I'll have to remember the name, but you talking about the 52% of workers saying there are children. Sometimes these children are as small as 5 years old, and they're dropped into literally these dark mines because they need their little hands. They're smaller. They can get into small places. We've known about this, but nobody wanted to talk about it. And when I was at this conference, and I brought up at the time, and this was probably 2014, 2015, something like that. I go, listen, they're dropping kids into mines. This is not a healthy environment. We should not be demanding minerals from places from countries that do that. And I had both Honda and Toyota, which were, of course, pushing at that time hybrids and EVs, come up to me and get in my face and tell me that I was not telling the truth. And so I pulled up the video. I said, well, so what are you saying that's not true? Those are isolated cases. We have ignored this for far too long.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's appalling to me. It's really amazing. And, consumer electronics started this off, but I think we've only seen the demand spikes for the energy transition minerals like cobalt that we all know are important for this, but we don't know where to source without relying on this because we've shut down our domestic mining opportunities.
That's right.
So I really think it's a concerning thing, and we shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't be offshoring all of these impacts and saying, well, it's out of sight, it's out of mind. We don't have to worry. That's just incredibly arrogant, I think.
Especially when there's such a concerted effort from some folks that tend to support these kinds of policies to capture other costs that they say aren't included in the cost of social cost of carbon.
The downstream.
Right, downstream costs that aren't, it's a de facto subsidy for oil and gas, yada, yada, yada. But of course, these hidden costs are attributed to, as you said, isolated incidents no, that's not real. We can't consider the human element of the...
that small child, that's fake.
Right. Like I said, we could spend a whole episode just on that topic, but I did want to ask you about another key finding related to decommissioning. Obviously, decommissioning is a hot topic these days, mostly about fossil fuels because there's such a policy-driven push to shut down coal plants, for instance, and natural gas facilities in some cases. But what does decommissioning look like for wind, solar, and battery projects, and how does that stack up compared to these other sources?
It's a really interesting question. I went into this not really knowing what the process was going to look like. And what we find with wind turbines and solar panels is that it will take 6 months to 2 years to actually tear these things down. And what you find is when you say, okay, look, wind has a roughly 20-year lifespan, solar panels roughly 25. Okay, that's as long as they are warranted for. What you find is that a lot of components of the solar panels go bad faster. I'm thinking specifically of the inverters that convert DC to AC that you can use in your homes. Those will fail around 10 or 11 years. And then the other really interesting part about this is that repowering. So you're replacing a bunch of components to this. That's occurring largely for financial reasons. And requalifying for the federal production tax credit is one of the big ones. In 2023, the median age of repowering for partial repowering for wind turbines was only about 11 years. So we are compounding. Yeah, we're compounding our issues by replacing this more often, and the federal government has set up these incentives that way. And that's what's scary to me too, because a lot of these components, yeah, sure, there's a lot of steel, there's a lot of glass. We know how to recycle that, but we have a lot of odd materials and in the metals and minerals involved. And what we often find too with wind turbine blades is that they're fiberglass, they're carbon fiber. That's challenging and difficult to recycle, and it's just simply not done. So those things are ending up in landfills too.
Yeah, I'm sure Colorado listeners can probably relate, at least folks on the Eastern Plains probably have seen those big flatbeds that haul giant fiberglass wind turbine blades to who knows where, potentially being recycled or potentially just in a landfill somewhere. Not to mention, this is a big problem we've talked about on the show before, but sort of the fly-by-night nature of some of these wind and solar companies that they put up installations and then they go out of business and then no one knows who owns the facility anymore. So they just kind of sit on the landscape in perpetuity because no one has the rights to even try to decommission them.
That's and I got to tell you, and Colorado has no state statute on decommissioning.
Right.
There is. It has to be done at the local level. Listen, I'm all for local control. I get it, but I got to tell you, if you have a well, there's bonding. There has to be an entire plan in place for decommissioning or for quote orphan wells or for decommissioning a well. No such thing for wind and solar. And I'll tell you what, that 11-year mark for repowering is stunning to me. Mm-hmm. You have essentially just doubled the price of it, because if you not entirely, when I get it, but to the point of there are some components for which you will have to double the price to account for its total life cycle. That's amazing. There's something else I want to get to, Sarah, if you don't mind. Wildlife concerns and ecological concerns. Everybody knows that I spent 4.5 years down in North Carolina. 3.5 of those years, I was fortunate enough to live right on the water and right on the Sound, and it's big ocean view. It's beautiful, and you have an appreciation for, at least where I was, that it was really the ocean's nursery. It was just this, it was teeming with life. Now, obviously you're not going to put them right offshore, but not too far offshore and so big that you would see them. It's also along North Carolina. There are dolphins, there are whales, there's so much marine life. What offshore wind has been doing to just the oceans in general is, to me, it's an ecological crime. But let's bring that back to Colorado, where we've also seen here eagles, raptors, bats, things that are equally important to the ecosystem, and these things are like giant Cuisinarts in the sky.
Yeah, I really care a lot about this one, and I think that's something that we ought to be thinking about, as well as just that these are not harmless to the environment and to the animals and organisms and habitats. And all of this is concrete, tangible ways. When you're looking out on the shore, you want to be able to see this ecosystem healthy. And that's so important to me, honestly. And offshore wind has a lot of concerns. I know that NOAA and other government agencies are saying that there aren't any lethal effects, but there's quite a number of reasons why whales may or may not be being affected by this. There's a lot of concerns with direct collisions within infrastructure, changes to habitat, feeding and migration patterns, and other issues there. Birds and bats on land-based turbines are very interesting because there's really not a great estimate out there of the actual number of birds and bats being struck. The credible estimates I found, and I cite in my paper, is anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million birds are struck at U.S.-based land turbines per year. But that's a pretty old estimate, and that actually is likely to be undercounted due to some study methods. A lot of these early studies were relying on human counters on foot to go through these projects and count the number of birds there. And then you find there's several studies that have used dog searchers instead. And dogs, obviously, with their keen sense of smell, are able to find way more corpses of birds and bats that have been struck. So it's likely in excess of 1 million. And a lot of the problem is not that there's a sheer quantity of birds. There's many human-caused causes of death for organisms like this, but we often see that birds of prey and shorebirds, seabirds, and other slower reproducing species are actually more vulnerable to being struck by turbines, in part because turbines are often located on slopes where these birds are trying to catch the updraft into soaring, and they are collided with in that time. And same thing with bats too, especially if you're cutting down forest habitat in order to put the turbines there. There's a lot of concerns around changes to habitat.
One thing that was super interesting in this section, to me at least, is that you actually included a bit about solar as well, and birds having a problem with solar installations. I don't think that's widely talked about at all. At least some people
You're right.
have understood for a while, especially out here in Colorado. We've had wind for a couple decades now. I think people have started to realize that birds are at risk from big turbine blades, but solar panels, you point out, also pose their own risk to these species, right?
Yeah, I found this really interesting too. Solar is hypothesized to create a sort of lake effect, where you're a bird, you're flying high above, you see the reflectiveness of utility scale panels below you, and you think it's a lake. It resembles the same thing from afar, and what you actually find is that there's evidence that shorebirds and seabirds will descend towards solar panels, risking direct collisions. There's often quite a number of collisions and corpses found for that, but it's more likely to be water birds than it is to be eagles and birds of prey and such, like it is at wind turbines. So I found that a really interesting relationship, and there's not a strong correlation either when you're doing your pre-siting work. You're deciding whether to site your solar panels here. There's only a really weak relationship between your scoping and how many corpses you actually find. So there's not a lot of evidence that that's really effective either. So you can think you're doing things right, and then you find out that you've placed this in a bad spot for wildlife.
One of the things too that just gets me as I was going through your study, we're incentivizing this. Government policy is to incentivize these things, and it's we're incentivizing ecological destruction. We're incentivizing poor environmental habits in other countries. We're incentivizing child labor. We're incentivizing, overuse of materials. It's I don't know. It just it makes me nuts.
Yeah, if I could piggyback off of that as we're coming close to time here, given that is the case and given all that you found in your research, what would you recommend that policymakers, maybe policymakers and the general public, what conversations should we be having that we're not having, and what discussions are desperately needed in our energy policy going forward?
It's a great question. I think communities need to take this kind of evidence, and I really wanted this to be extensively sourced because I know that a lot of people are out there looking for these kind of resources and they simply can't find them. And so what I would say is I hope communities take these conclusions, this wealth of evidence, frankly, whenever there's a project proposed in their neighborhood. If they've decided that this is something that you want to do in your local area, then you need to be well informed about the trade-offs. The other thing I think policymakers need to think about is the land use component. One thing we didn't touch on really is that a lot of these projects are being located on prime agricultural land. That's, I think, a public policy concern, that we're trading off a bunch of this land use for intermittent weather-dependent generation. And of course, the converse of this, too, is understanding that coal, natural gas, nuclear, all of these technologies have positive impacts that we're not thinking about correctly. Small land use footprints, low material requirements, all of those are things that we need to consider.
Real quick, I want to just before we say goodbye to Sarah, I took your study, plugged it into AI, and said, okay, so extrapolate some of the numbers and what would Colorado need to fulfill its green dreams? We usually call it their fantasy of 100% wind, solar, and batteries by 2040. And so, if, for instance, if you were going to do, and this is what. They used a capacity factor. I love this. 90% capacity factor for nuclear, which is way low. 35% for wind, which is probably high. 25% for solar, which we know is high. But I just want to throw out a couple of numbers. I won't go through all of it, but this is what you'd need in steel: 2.8 million tons for wind. 525,000 tons for solar. That's just in steel. Or nuclear powering the whole state at 320,000 tons. Concrete, 12.5 million tons. Not much for solar, but 1.5 million tons for nuclear. Copper, 43,000 tons for wind, 12,000 tons for nuclear. Land, to your point, Sarah, about a square mile for just per plant, per gigawatt plant. In wind, you'd need 90 to 100 square miles, 47 square miles for solar. I mean, the impact, and we haven't even talked about the wildlife, right? We haven't even talked about birds of prey, which is a huge problem on the Eastern Plains. So, thank you for doing this. I mean, the environmental costs are very real, but they're always ignored by those who want wind and solar and the mainstream media. They won't even talk about it.
No, it's a great point on the media piece for sure. They're always happy to point out the trade-offs when it comes to conventional thermal-based resources, but suddenly the trade-offs don't seem to exist anymore when it comes time to talk about future policy plans. But do you have any takeaways for our listeners?
I do. I'll quote you and quote Thomas Sowell. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. And Colorado is going to have to come to grips with the trade-offs of wind, solar, and batteries. It's going to be brutal. It isn't just the cost. It is what we are doing to what we know to be Colorado. That's number one. Number two, that 11 years figure just sticks in my brain. And there are going to be components that, if you're repowering after 11 years, the price of wind and solar just went up. And then do the environment a favor. And when you get your generator, for sure, make it a fossil fuel one. Just, do wildlife a favor.
And firm your own grid.
To firm your own grid, use fossil fuels. Yep.
But you heard her, folks. We'll, of course, drop Sarah's full report in the show notes. I highly encourage listeners to check it out. It's chock full of a ton of great. We didn't even get to a fraction of what's in this report, so folks should definitely check this out. But that does it for us on another episode here of PowerGab. If folks like what they saw, they can head over to powergab.org to check out our entire back catalog. We produce new episodes every single week. We're also available wherever you get your audio shows, whether that's Spotify or Apple. And if you want to reach out to us to suggest future show topics or other great guests like Sarah that you'd like to see us interview, you can send those our way at info@powergab.org. We always love hearing from you guys. And until next week, we'll see you.